Good morning, America. Today I'm continuing my series on the Great Depression. I'm going to talk about the effects of the Depression, and I'm going to talk about the presidential election of 1932. Alright, so the Great Depression, what did this actually look like? What constituted a depression? Well, first of all, the main thing that constituted the Depression was the collapse of lots of different things. Specifically the collapse of industry, the collapse of business, and the collapse of banking. All right, the collapse of industry was a result partly of the stock market unraveling, partly just a general business slowdown, and partly because of the effects of the Smoot-Hawley tariff that I talked about in the previous video, and the effect of the various tariffs that European countries passed in retaliation to the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Whatever the cause, the effect is the same. Businesses going out of business. Tremendous number of industries and businesses in America, all across America, close their doors and never open again. Companies go bankrupt. Ordinary businesses close their doors. Industries that do manage to stay in business, they're forced to lay off some or all of their employees. Factories are idled. It's a really tough situation. And the effect of all those businesses closing, of course, is mass unemployment. Unemployment climbed steadily throughout 1930, 1931, 1932. By 1932, unemployment in the United States reached an astonishing, overwhelming, approximately 30%. It means that 1 in 3 Americans that wanted a job, was of working age, was looking for a job, could not find a job. Unbelievable. That is millions and millions of people unemployed. Nothing like it has happened in America since then until about 2 weeks ago. And we're now facing possibly a similar type of situation. But up until a few weeks ago, nothing like this had ever happened before or since at any time in American history. Millions of people unemployed. All those businesses going out of business in turn has a terrible effect on banks, and banks start failing. Now, at this time in American history, banks were mostly unregulated by the government, and there was no safety net. So remember the way a bank works. A bank doesn't actually keep your money. There's a famous scene from the movie It's a Wonderful Life that depicts this situation. But as is explained in that movie, when you put your money in a bank, your bank doesn't actually keep all of it. They only keep a little bit of it. Most of it they loan right back out again. That works as long as most people are content to leave their money in the bank most of the time. But if a rumor starts going around, hey, the bank's about to go out of business, suddenly everybody runs down to the bank and wants their money back all at once. Well, that doesn't work because the money's not there. It's been loaned out again. When everybody shows up and wants their money all at once, it's called a bank run. And these happened periodically through American history up to this time. In the early 1930s, there were runs on banks all across America. And the money's not there because it's been loaned out, most of it. And so the bank has no choice but to close its doors. And when the bank closes, it goes out of business and it's gone. And anybody who had money in that bank who didn't manage to get out before the bank closes, they've lost all their money. It's gone. And there's nobody to help them. And banks, thousands of banks close in the United States in the early 1930s. Every single one of those bank closures means thousands of people and businesses lose all their money. And so businesses that maybe wouldn't have gone out of business otherwise, they end up going out of business because they lost all their money when their bank closed. And ordinary people who didn't lose all their savings when the stock market crashes, they lose all their savings when their bank goes out of business. So that makes things that much worse. By early 1932, the nation's banking industry was on the verge of utter and total collapse. Banks were failing left and right. Nobody's money was safe. the entire banking system was teetering on the verge of collapse. Now, in terms these boring economic events had very real-world effects in terms of effects on ordinary people's lives. People are unemployed. When people are unemployed, they're not making any money, and when they're not making any money, well, then it starts to get hard to eat on a regular basis. The people in the cities are worst off because they're unemployed, they can't find jobs, and they're hungry. They're literally starving. Charities, remember, there is no such thing as government welfare at this time. If you're poor, you're supposed to go for charity. Well, the charities of the day are totally overwhelmed. They don't have the resources to help all the people. People stand in line for hours just to get a little bit of food. Bread lines form in major cities all across America outside of charities that are offering food called soup kitchens. You stand in line for hours and you get a little piece of bread and a cup of soup, and that's probably your meal for the day. The people who are in the city have things the worst off. Now remember, a lot of Americans at this time don't live in cities yet, though they still are farmers out in the countryside. The farmers are a little bit better off than the city dwellers. The farmers at least are not in imminent danger of starvation because they can grow their own food. So they may not have any money, but at least they're not in danger of imminently starving because they've got eggs from the chickens and whatever produce they can grow during the growing season and so forth. So the country folks are poor, but at least they're not starving to death. They have enough to eat. City dwellers are literally starving. People lose their houses. They can no longer pay their house payments. Their houses get foreclosed on. Large numbers of people are forced out of their houses. This is the first time you have mass homelessness in America. Homelessness was never a problem in America before 1930. But now, suddenly, for the first time ever in American history, large numbers of people have no place to live, not even a tenement or a shack. People make shacks for themselves, little homeless encampments of shacks made out of scrap lumber and scrap metal and cardboard and whatever they can find spring up in cities all across America. They call them Hoovervilles because they blame President Hoover personally for all their problems. So in bitterness, they call them Hoovervilles. There was a Hooverville in Central Park in the middle of New York City. There were Hoovervilles on vacant lots and in parks all across America. A lot of people have lost everything. They have nothing, especially younger single men. They lose everything. They have no jobs. They have nothing. So they just start traveling from one place to another. And they travel by hopping a freight train. And so the freight trains of the era are packed with passengers. They were called hobos, which was not a compliment. People joke that the symbol of the era is you see people walking around in that day and age with their pockets turned inside out like this. And people joke that when you're walking around with your pockets turned inside out that you're flying your Hoover flags. Again, they're making fun of President Hoover because they blame him for everything. It's all his fault. Now, this leads to a very bizarre event that happened in the summer of 1932 called the Bonus Army March. What happened was that Congress, some years earlier, had voted out of gratitude for the service of American soldiers during World War I, had voted that every veteran of World War I would get a bonus chunk of money, a one-time bonus payment. However, Congress decided not to actually pay that money. They were going to hold it and pay it out later. I believe the payout date was sometime in the earlier mid-1940s. That is to say, more than a decade in the future at that time. Now, the veterans were happy to wait for their money as long as times were good. But with times being so terrible, the World War I veterans all got together and they marched to Washington, D.C., and they said, they petition Congress, give us our bonus now. Congress says, no, we won't. Go home. Some of them went home. A lot of them didn't. They made the Hooverville of all Hoovervilles, out on Anacostia Flats, out on the edge of Washington, D.C. And some of them started occupying unused federal buildings. The Washington, D.C. Police Department asked the federal government for help. The United States military decided that the Bonus Army marchers needed to be expelled. The Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army, a man named Douglas MacArthur, remember that name, it'll come up again later. Douglas MacArthur formed up his troops on Pennsylvania Avenue near the White House and sent them down Pennsylvania Avenue to attack the Bonus Army marchers. There were foot soldiers with rifles and bayonets, there were cavalry soldiers with swords, and there were tanks. They attacked the Bonus Army marchers with tear gas. They drove them out of their Hooverville, and they burned the United States military under the command of Douglas MacArthur, burned their Hooverville to the ground, and the Bonus Army marchers were dispersed. Some of them went back home. Some of them never did make it home, just became hobos, wandering America from one end to the other. This happened just months before the 1932 presidential election, in which Herbert Hoover was running for re-election. The attack against the Bonus Army marchers made headlines. Of course, it's not a very good look to be sending tanks and bayonets against former veterans of the United States military. That's not a good look. But even without the Bonus Army March, the American people blamed Hoover for all their problems, so he never really had much of a chance in the 1932 presidential election. On top of that, he is up against Franklin Delano Roosevelt, former governor of New York, who runs a truly inspired campaign. FDR, he's often referred to by his initials, and yes, he's related to Theodore Roosevelt, they're cousins. Franklin Delano Roosevelt runs a really inspired campaign where he basically is promising the American people that if they will elect him, he will come in and he will come running to the rescue and fix all their problems. He doesn't say exactly how he's going to fix all their problems, only that he will. I'm paraphrasing here. What the American people want, and, unless I miss my guess, what the American people need is persistent experimentation, says Roosevelt in his very patrician upstate New York tones. And that is what he intended to give them, was persistent experimentation. So he didn't tell anybody exactly how he was going to fix the Depression, only that he was. And the American people blamed Hoover for everything, and so that sounded good to them. Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the 1932 election very handily. And he comes into office, and honestly, even before he came into office, he was already kind of sliding into the presidency. A few days before Roosevelt came into office, the banking system was teetering on the edge of collapse. Roosevelt basically told all the state governors, if you wouldn't mind, please declare a bank holiday in your states until I can get into office to save the banking system. Roosevelt comes into office. He gives this very inspirational first inaugural address that I had you watch and read. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. This very famous line where he is trying to calm the American people. And again, that speech is short on specifics. He doesn't say exactly how he's going to fix it, but long on promises and trying to give people hope and inspiration. So next time I will talk about what FDR actually did and what effect it had. See you later.